Welcome to this video. Yeah, this is a new episode of the Chess Openings Uncovered series. Maybe a series that some of you don't even know, because I did a couple of videos, 3 exactly, in this series, but it sort of got to a stop some time ago, and I thought, why not do something new here? Yeah, looking at one particular opening and trying to get an overview what's going on there. How does this opening unfold? What are the ideas? What are the main points? And some variations, to illustrate what's happening. And I'll be looking at the Nimzo-Indian. Yeah, this is an opening that features very frequently on my channel in my Blitz games, simply because I tested out a couple of lines that I'm featuring in my upcoming book, and also I have it quite often as white. The Nimzo-Indian is simply a very complex opening that, of course, arises after, if we put it on the board, arises here. I actually came to I got this idea to look at the Nimzo here for this video. I got this idea because I saw a post on Reddit, the chess page on Reddit, and someone called Carmelist, he posted a question. He said, I want to play this opening as black, but I have some questions. I understand the idea of c7, c5. Yeah, sometimes this move, c7, c5, blocking possible double pawns, or d6 and e5, closing the center. D6 and e5. But what idea does the move d5 have? Sometimes black is also playing with d5. And why doesn't white take on c5 or e5? I think that opening the center is good for white because he has two bishops. Okay, he has more of a general strategic question. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at some lines of this opening and try to explain what are the ideas behind those pawn pushes in the center and the central formations that can come up. So I'm going to address the questions that he posed, but I will do so with some concrete positions to look at, because those kind of general questions are very difficult to answer, especially in an opening like the Nimzo, because the main advantage, or one main point of the Nimzo-Indian, is its flexibility. This is a very flexible opening. And why? Because the pawn structure that black will have is not yet determined. What he's doing with those 3 first moves is being very economical. Knight out, the pawn, the bishop, and he's ready to castle. On move 4, this is something that is sometimes not really appreciated. Black is castling on move 4 in many lines. For example, if white plays queen c2 or e3, the move castles is actually the main continuation. This is happening very early. There are only very little lines in the whole chess where black is going to castle that quickly. And while doing so, he has developed the bishop and taken some central influence over the e4 square. That's, of course, a very important feature. Black is fighting for e4 for the moment, just with pieces. It is actually a common misconception that this is the whole idea of the Nimzo, to fight for the center with pieces. Sometimes you read that, and it's just plain wrong. The thing is, there are lines where in fact there is central influence with pieces. In the initial position, definitely e4 is covered due to the tactic on e4. But in most lines, in the vast majority of lines, black will put pawns in the center. It is just delayed. The good thing about this, however, is that according to circumstances, according to what white does, black can decide how to put the pawns. This is a big difference to the Queen's Gambit declined that could pop up after d5. A little different move order. It could also happen after d4, d5, c4, e6, and then the knights. But here you are totally fixed to this kind of structure with a pawn on d5 that you will maintain very often. Sometimes you will take, but you have a pawn on d5. You're not going to put it on d6. It's just on d5 already. And with the Nimzo, you're very flexible in that regard. And in some cases, you might never move the d pawn. There are games where this pawn never moves. Yeah, so what are the lines that are available, and how do they, how are the pawn structures connected to them? White really has tried about everything under the sun against the Nimzo. And the two main continuations by far, this is an opening that does not have a clearly defined main line. In some openings, it is very clear what the principled approach is. Let's say, if you take the King's Indian, for example, it is very clear that the classical King's Indian is the main line. Or if you see e4, e5, it's clear that the Rue Lopez is going to be the main line, and it will always be the main line probably. In the Nimzo, it's not so clear. There are two equally popular moves, Queen c2 and e3, and they happen with about the same frequency. Both are played in about, I need to look it up. I looked it up actually a couple of weeks ago. In about 30% of the games, like in 30%, about 30% this move and 30% this move, and the rest 40% is kind of distributed among the other moves that can happen. I will look at the two main moves later, but let's just look at the other things that White can do. The oldest continuation against the Nimzo, actually, probably the oldest, is the move a3, the Semisch variation, named after Fritz Semisch, a German grandmaster. Yeah, there's also Semisch in the King's Indian. Yeah, it's a well-known name in chess theory, which is basically said, okay, I don't mind, give me the double pawns.
Check.
Okay, Black is happy to oblige. Yeah, what is White's idea with this? Isn't this kind of weird to double the pawns like that? Yeah, in a way it is. It is a very sharp continuation. White is basically saying goodbye to his pawn structure. This is really weak. Yeah, if we look at this, especially c4 and c3. And this is very important to understand. In this doubled pawn formations in the Nimzo, the problem is not just that the pawns are weak, it's also that all those squares are weak. That means that when one of those pawns, if one of those pawns is going to fall, like the c4 pawn, there's still a glaring weakness on c4. It's a pawn that's going to get lost, but also a weakness where a piece might land. The whole queen side is basically destroyed here for White in long term. And this is very important. It also means that in some cases it's even not a big issue if Black is playing, for example, well, it's not a line that is particularly great, but in general, if a move like d5 happens and there is a trade, there's still a weakness on c4. There's not a pawn there, but there might be a piece on c4 in some cases. Yeah, like a knight could come there, knight could come there, it could attack c3. Yeah, it means this is a permanently weak queen side, even if the pawn is not there anymore on c4. However, here in this double pawn formation, Black's normal idea to play is to directly attack those pawns. Black very often will avoid the move d5, but will instead put pressure on this pawn. Very often he wants to make sure that the pawn is never running away, yeah, with c5, fixing those pawns. This is actually a point that this poster on Reddit mentioned. Yeah, c7, c5 to block the double pawns. That's true. This is a way of blocking those pawns, and Black very often will get this in. Knight to a5, b6, bishop a6. Yeah, focusing all his power on the c4 pawn. And very often this pawn will fall. This is a very common plan against the doubled pawns in the Nimzo. To be perfectly honest, there are not that many lines that actually feature this double pawn. The Semisch is, let's say, the oldest, the core version of that, where White is really forcing the structure right on move 4 or move 5, however you want to see it. And there are not that many other lines that have the double pawn. Very often White takes care of that, or the capture is not that attractive for Black, because he only rarely wants to take there unless being kicked with a3. It's just a tempo a tempo issue. Yeah, in the Sämisch you have a battle that normally looks like that. White is going to push his center up and black is going to attack c4. Yeah, this is a line that I have played frequently in my blitz games, not because it is so brilliant for white, but it is a very sharp, entertaining line to play. Yeah, it leads to sometimes complete chaos, and it's just very fun to play on videos. Yeah, it's very rarely that you have a boring game. Yeah, here black is normally playing c5, fixing the double pawns and attacking the pawns. This is the Sämisch variation. There are some more sub-variations, but this is the general theme of this line. White can also try to improve in a way on the Sämisch. In the Sämisch, very often white ultimately wants to build up this big pawn center. And he can also say, okay, a3, I don't need that move. I play f3 immediately. I want to go e4, fighting for this e4 square. And on that, black has a wide variety of options. He should do something about this e4 idea. If he just allows e4 and then sits around, he will have a problem, simply because he has no central control. f3 is really a move that signals black, okay, e4 is coming, do something about it. And black has to fight this idea. He can either play d5. This is a case where d5 makes perfect sense. Why? Well, you're striking in the center and fight for space there in a moment where white has played the move f3. If you think of the Queen's Gambit, for example, white very rarely would put a pawn on f3 because it's simply wrong there. It blocks the knight. Black is actually trying to open up the position in a situation where white has a development problem. Yeah, he's behind in development. That's very important to see, and he will take a long while until he has castled short. So d5 is totally logical, opening up the position. There are other versions of that idea actually. Black can also castle first, as mentioned, castling on move 4. And after e4, looking scary, he has to strike. Black, here this is a kind of only move situation. Black will get run over unless he plays d5. So he has to. d5 pushing in the center and breaking up the center. So this is a typical example of this, as they called it at the time, hyper-modern approach. Yeah, you temporarily give white the opportunity to occupy the center, but then you fight it. And here with d5, later c5, black is breaking up the center, which leads to very sharp play. White is behind in development, yeah, very, very important. And black will quite often get a good attack here, really, a good attack against the king, if white is not careful. It's a case where overexpanding might happen easily. But f3 can be answered totally differently. As mentioned, it is a very flexible opening that black has. c5 is also possible, attacking the center. This makes also some sense because the natural move might be knight f3, yeah, to kind of support this pawn, but it's not available anymore, so white will push it, gaining some space. And here black, again, white is threatening in a way, strategically speaking, to put up this big center with e4, bishop d3, knight e2, and so on. He has to do something. He cannot just sit around. And here we see another key idea that is possible. Black can play b5, very aggressively attacking the center. This is actually the line that I recommend in my upcoming book. It's super aggressive stuff that attacks the white center immediately. f3 is a sharp move. It's a move that I actually recommended in a d4 repertoire series produced a while ago, because white also has its chances. It's a very principled approach against the Nimzo, and black has various ways to fight it, c5 or d5, with totally different ideas. d5 in a more classical way, and c5, d5, b5 in gambit style that breaks down the center. Note that after here, if white really is greedy and takes everything, we get a fantastic compensation, yeah, with this big pawn center. And here the move f3 looks entirely ridiculous, as white is completely behind in development. Black is even coming up with this, or e5. Yeah, what a center. A fantastic position. So white cannot even take the pawn. It's not a real pawn sacrifice. It's just very aggressively attacking the center. Yeah, those f3 and the Semisch is kind of related also in spirit, but here very often white is able to avoid the move a3. He sometimes does play it. Yeah? After d5, for example, white does play a3 because he's simply out of other moves. He has to clarify the situation in the center. And here black's main line is actually to play this and then c5. This is a case where black is playing d5 and c5, as the Reddit poster mentioned. There are some of those cases. Why is black doing that here? Development is the key. He's better developed. Knight is out already, and he's opening up the center in a moment where white is kind of unorganized. Yeah, the move f3 looks kind of weird. He has no piece out. And also note that after c takes, knight takes, which is the main line, there's still a weakness here. Yeah, or c4 is a weak square. Yeah, just the double pawns going away is one thing, but there are still tons of weaknesses left on the queen side. Very often, actually, in those kind of positions, black is allowing this capture, being a pawn down, and he says, okay, your pawns are so weak here, I don't mind, I will pick them up later. Yeah, this is a very valid line for black. This is a3 and f3. Both of these moves are kind of ambitious, yeah, and not very much focused on development. There are also moves that focus on development. Knight f3, for example, is quite popular nowadays. Very natural move. Puts a piece out where it belongs, yeah, actually knight on f3. And here again, black is super flexible. Here, in fact, is a case where black can delay putting a pawn in the center for a very long time with b6, in spirit of the Queen's Indian, where you fianchetto this bishop. Here, you can actually get away with not playing d5 or c5 for quite a while. For example, there are lines like this. Let's say e3, bishop here, knight e4. Yeah, putting more pressure here. Queen c2, takes, and f5. This is a typical approach, mixing the Nimzo Queen's Indian themes with a little bit of the Dutch, yeah, with the f5 move. Here black will not play c5 or d5 for a long time probably. Yeah, d5 not at all, and c5 maybe in very rare cases, but other than that he's very content with having this nice piece on e4. Now after knight f3, however, black also can play c5. There's nothing wrong with that. And go for a development with knight to c6. Or sometimes he can also use queen a5 to put pressure on this knight. Yeah, very flexible. There are many themes that are going to be mixed. For example, if white now plays g3, an idea that is really popular nowadays, fianchettoing here. Black has ideas like capturing, creating the double pawns, and play the queen to a5. Yeah, here the pawn will stay on d7, and very often we will go for this development, focusing on the weaknesses. There are other ideas though. In my book, for example, I have this one. I'm sorry, bishop g2, knight e4, increasing the pressure like that on the c3 knight. After knight f3, very often those non-d5 approaches are going to be applied. One reason is that it is very often, as mentioned, connected to the fianchetto, and when the bishop comes to g2, the c4 pawn is more weak than usual. Yeah, it makes lots of sense then to concentrate on this possible double pawn, this weakness on c4. Black, of course, can play d5, but this is actually a transposition to a Queen's Gambit Rogozin. The Rogozin variation of the Queen's Gambit, very popular nowadays, is a mixture of the Queen's Gambit and the Nimzo actually. Yeah, so black is very flexible. He can also castle, by the way, and delay his decision here if he wants to go c5 or d5. There's also a line bishop g5 here, where white just develops the bishop first. Yeah, that's an interesting line, the Leningrad variation as it is called. And here, in fact, black quite often will also make this double pawn on c3. For example, a line that is very popular here is this.
Check.
Yeah, where black is going to close the center, this kind of formation, and create the double pawn. This is another central formation that is quite frequently seen in the Nimzo. A very solid way to play, closing the center and putting the pawns there on dark squares. This is a prime example of the so-called dark squared strategy. Means that you put the pawns on the dark squares, c5, d6, e5, after your bishop is exchanged or developed outside of the pawn chain. There are also some lines where the bishop is still there on b4, but you still put those pawns on the dark squares. The idea is that with the bishop traded, this is really the most frequent case, you have a very sound pawn structure. Pawns are on dark squares, and you have the light squared bishop left. So this is a good combination to have. You don't have the bishop on f8 anymore, which would be a bad bishop. Yeah, sometimes in the King's Indian, black suffering from this kind of formation, where he has a bishop on g7 and it looks at his own pawn and cannot really get out. This is never happening here. You really, from the very get-go, you have a very strategically sound position. You will never have a truly long-term bad piece here. Yeah, okay, we can completely screw up in the middle game and put your knights in the corners or whatever, but it's nothing that is kind of inherent to the structure. There are some openings that carry this kind of danger with them. The dark squared bishop in the King's Indian is an example, or the light squared bishop in the French. Yeah, it can happen, yeah, and this is not happening here very much, that black will suffer from a bad bishop simply because the pawns are already on the right squares. This kind of approach is happening in some other lines as well. We come to that. Against the Leningrad variation, this is a very valid approach. Black has some others. He can also go for this kind of structure, which is normally called the Nimzo-Benoni. Yeah? This is a Benoni structure. In the modern Benoni, the bishop is normally on g7, but here it is on b4. It's an interesting way to play, something that I have in my book as well. There are many possibilities. Note that after bishop g5, black is not so often playing d5. Why is that? Yeah, the reason is that if you compare this to the f3 variation earlier, here this f3 has not been played, so white can develop very fluently. Yeah, there is very little incentive for black to put it on c5 here, because white's development is not hampered. And in these structures, it's not so clear what you will do with this kind of pin. It sometimes can be a problem in the light squared center, this pin, and the bishop is on b4. This combination is not so easy to play. It's not a terribly bad move, but it is quite uncommon to do it. Yeah, these were a couple of less frequently seen lines, but the main lines really. What about the main lines? Yeah, let's start with the move e3. As mentioned, played in more than 30% of all Nimzo-Indian games. The e3 line is called the Rubinstein Variation, named after the famous they didn't have the Grandmaster title back then, really, in our modern sense, but let's call him Grandmaster Rubinstein. And he invented, let's say, or he popularized this reply to the Nimzo. E3, what is the idea? It's a very sound move. What it wants to do is it wants to get the king side developed, finally. Yeah, we shouldn't forget, if you look at the initial position of the Nimzo, black is ready to castle the next move, and white is still a couple of moves away from that. He needs one pawn move, a knight move, a bishop move, and then he can castle. Black is actually ahead in development, and he will be castled much quicker. That sounds a bit abstract, because the position at the moment is kind of close. There is no direct clash of both sides, but it can become very, very relevant if white is kind of neglecting his development of the king side even further. There are some cases where black really gets quick attacks based on this fact, and we will see some of those lines when we look at the queen c2 variation. Queen c2 is the other main line, which in fact does not accelerate the king side development. e3, preparing development, bishop out, knight out, castling. The other idea of e3 is different. White might also play the move knight g to e2, or knight to e2, yeah, there's no g to e2 because of the pin. Knight to e2 to cover, let's say, the c3 knight and be able to recapture with the knight, which would be very convenient, yeah, avoiding a double pawn on c3 while getting developed on the king side. This is another idea. White, in fact, has those two basic development plans after e3, putting the knight on f3, bishop d3, castling. Yeah, so let's say this is one basic plan. For example, if we just look at the white moves, I had to put out something for black. This is one basic plan. The other plan is to put the knight to e2. This can happen after bishop d3. Yeah, and then castling. Or it can happen immediately on move 5. These are the two basic plans that white has. In any case, white can always play a3 later, by the way. Yeah, for example, here he could play a3, and then we would transpose to a Sämisch. This is always an option. In fact, a way that that I usually play the Sämisch if I'm going for that in my blitz games. Yeah, e3, mostly a developing move. It looks like it hampers the bishop. That's true. For the moment it does, but this is very rarely a problem, because in most lines this bishop will come to life, and we'll see how this is going to happen. After e3, black has a wide range of options. There are many lines, and this is a very positive feature. This flexibility that I mentioned gives black so many options to choose from that this opening can be a very long-term companion for a player, because you play it and you can very often just change some sub-variations that you're probably not content with. Yeah, there you play one particular line against e3 and then you discover, okay, this is not so much to my liking. Then you don't need to discard the whole opening. You just switch a little sub-variation. Yeah, it's not like you need to buy a new car every day in case of just one tire has a little hole. Yeah? This is in this opening, this is the case as well. You can just put a little thing to the repair shop and you still can use it. After e3, what are black's options? He has to choose a central formation. Note that black, if he wanted, he could capture on c3.
Check.
But this is very rarely done in this particular situation, because white's development is completely flexible. Yeah, for example, white can still play like that and then put out e4, f4 and so on. It's a little bit like a Sämisch variation where white was not forced, is wrong, but he hasn't spent a move on a3. This is rarely done. There are cases where black captures voluntarily, in particular a variation that is named after German Grandmaster Robert Huebner. We come to that. This is a very specific case, and very important to understand the difference. Why taking here is not so great. We will see that when we look at the Huebner variation. After e3, black has, as mentioned, many options. One option is to play b6, combining the pin here with the king side, with the queen side fianchetto. We actually saw something earlier that can also come up like that. This kind of idea, very valid. After b6, white can also go here and ask black what he's going to do about this situation. In fact, knight e2 is nowadays considered as a pretty good reply to b6, because here white quite often will get the bishop pair without any concession. This is important to understand. With bishop b4, black very often gives up the bishop pair in cases, and he needs to have some kind of compensation for that. the bishop pair is almost comparable to something material in chess, like a pawn. It's not that much worth like a pawn, but it is something long-term, and you don't want to give it up for nothing. You want to have some structural concession from white, you want to have better development, or you want to have a very flexible, sound structure. And here, for example, if you look at this, a line like this, like say bishop out,
check,
and black takes, this is simply not completely satisfactory outcome of the opening for black. He has given up the bishop pair without a structural concession, and white will relatively quickly get his kingside developed. Yeah, very often black has to do something now to play in the center. Yeah, like something with d5, not right now, it blunders a piece to queen a4, but he has to do something in the center now, and he shouldn't just give up the bishop pair like that. Here's even a funny line that is quite popular nowadays, looks kind of exotic, but it shows that you really don't want to take on c3 here and allow the recapture with the knight. In fact, I believe that practically all lines where black will capture against a knight e2 setup and white can recapture with a knight, I think they're all not 100% precise. Yeah, you should avoid that as black. Yeah, b6 is a viable line. Black can also play c5, or he can play with d5. There is a bit of a difference if you castle first or play c5 or d5 immediately, but I don't want to go there much. Let's just say black castles first. You have to do that in any case. And let's say we start here. White plays bishop d3 if we start with this development plan. Here black has to choose. You can go with a d5 based setup or with a c5 based setup. You can combine both moves, of course, but let's say you want to put it on d5. After this, very often it will unfold like that. Knight to f3, knight to e2 is also possible, as mentioned. Knight to f3, c5, castles. Yeah, this is a case where black has put out pawns on c5 and d5. And our poster here on Reddit asked, okay, why does black do that? The reason is that why not put pawns in the center? It's not a bad thing. The Queen's Gambit, for example, where it is done, is not a bad opening. What black did here, well, he started with bishop b4, but there is no particular reason why not to play c5 or d5 now. We fight for the center with our pawns, and we have the bishop outside on b4. Note that, compared to the Queen's Gambit declined, white here has a bishop on c1. Yeah, this is kind of the concession that white was forced in, not forced, but white made on move 4. For getting the kingside developed quickly, you temporarily have the bishop on c1. Here black, in fact, has a wide range of options. The most popular way to play this nowadays is to trade here and play b6, a line that is normally called the Karpov variation. Karpov played this very, very often with very good results, and he actually got this out of the Nimzo and also out of the Caro-Kann. Yeah, you can get it out of the Panov Caro-Kann. I don't want to show the particular move order, but it can happen. Yeah, here we see another transformation. Black has cleared the center and now intends to put the bishop on b7. He now went for playing against the isolated queen pawn. Very valid option. There are other ways to play. Black can also play knight c6, just develop. And here, this kind of center can pop up. White can force the trade on c3. Okay, black can play bishop a5, but that's a different story. Yeah, here we have a different version of the pawn structure. Here, for example, we have a case where black is allowing this capture on d5, so allowing white to get rid of his double pawns. But this is not the end of the world. Black here has other benefits by taking, for example, this problem has been solved for him. Yeah, so it's a trade-off. White got rid of his double pawn, but black got his bishop out, possibly. Also, here black sometimes has the option of playing c4, b5, a5, pushing his 4 against 3 majority on the queen side. The d5 c5 setups against the Rubinstein are actually the most popular setups nowadays. You just put both pawns there. A different way to play it is associated with the move c5, where black is not playing d5. We will see how this unfolds. Knight f3, knight to c6, castles, and now an interesting way to play, and one main feature of my proposed repertoire in this upcoming book is this so-called Huebner variation. I already mentioned that. This is again a line that strives for the dark squared central setup. Pawns on dark squares after the bishop has been traded. The very basic way to do it is like that. This is the old main line of the Huebner variation that was played back in the early 70s. For example, in the very famous fifth match game between Boris Spassky and Bobby Fischer, where Fischer won a very nice game with the black pieces, with a very ingenious concept that was really revolutionary at the time. He played like that. And knight g6, this was a move that was completely blowing people's minds at the time. Nowadays this is very well known, this kind of idea. But at the time it looked crazy that black would allow this kind of structure, but it is very, very valid for black. Okay, I don't want to go into this detail. What is the point of this pawn structure? Okay, black is very solid with this bishop on the right color complex, and he has ideas to play on the flanks. Yeah, black wants to play f5 sometimes, or in some specific cases he can also play for b5. This has to be carefully considered, of course, because it trades away the double pawn. Note that the double pawn at the moment is not such a big issue for white. It cannot easily be attacked. This is also the reason why black is going to e7 and not to a5. It's a very important thing to understand. The move knight a5, attacking this somewhat weakened pawn, is more appropriate in cases where the center is still fluid. With a closed center here, this is not that problematic, because the maximum that black can do in terms of pressure is b6, bishop a6, like this. Let's say, let's put something out. Okay, I play h3, b6. This is not making much sense, but I just want to show you the actual idea. This is the best that black can do, and we can easily protect it like this. Or sometimes white can also do this maneuver while keeping this protected. And this is not leading to much. In the Samish, for example, there is no closed center. There black sometimes can even put a bishop here, a rook on c8, and threaten to capture on d4 to put more pressure here. And this is not happening in the Huebner variation. Here black absolutely should go to e7. The reason is that very often the king side is the main battleground. White will try to gain space on the king side quite often with ideas like, let's say, g3, f4 at some moment. And black is also playing with this f5 idea. Sometimes the knight can also go to g6. Yeah, this is a situation where the center is completely closed and play will be on the flanks. The Huebner variation can also be played a little bit differently with white. White can also avoid the move e4. He can play things like that. Knight d2, and then black plays e5. Here we have a situation that where the original poster here on Reddit said, okay, why is white not taking or exchanging on e5? The reason is, and I probably should explain it with this position, if you capture on c5 or e5 in this kind of situation, you really don't accomplish that much with white. Especially this bishop stays a pretty sorry piece. It's not doing very much. And in terms of opening the position, the problem here with white is that you're not going to open the queen side ever, because there is no way of breaking it up. Yeah, black is just putting out b6 and is stable as a rock here. There is no kind of dynamism here. And the only way to really open up this kind of position is on the king side. And you rather want to open the king side with the pawns being here, as this defines a very clear advantage in space for you. You at least have the advantage in space. Without those pawns, that is not happening. The only reason where white ever would want to trade here is a situation where white could plant a knight on d5. This is not so easy here, but you can try that. Yeah, this was shown in some classic games by Michal Botwinnik. Maybe I have featured one of Botwinnik's games in the middle game strategy series, Botwinnik against Shekhova, I think, where he puts the knight on d5 in this kind of structure. Other than that, the capture is very unpromising, actually. There are other situations where the center can be opened. For example, after knight d2, which is a move that is played quite often by white, the idea is to ultimately still use the f-pawn. e5, there are situations where the center will get opened. For example, here, white can ignore this pressure on d4 by playing a move like rook b1. And here, for example, black should be very reluctant to grab this pawn, as this is really opening up the bishops, yeah, while the exchange on c5 or e5 is not doing it. This is a fantastic position for white's bishop pair. Yeah, so in the Huebner, you want to close the center as black, keep it closed, play on the flanks. This is a big part of my repertoire that I describe in the book. White can also, as mentioned, develop with this kind of formation. Here black, of course, does not want to trade on c3, as this gives up the bishop pair without any structural compensation. Yeah, in the Huebner you at least give him the double pawn, but this is not happening here. Here black's best is actually switch back to a d5 setup, where we will get again an isolated queen pawn position. Yeah, this is just like the Karpov variation before, but there the knight was on f3, here it is on e2. Little bit of a difference, but the strategic themes are very, very comparable. The other thing is, white can, of course, as mentioned, cover this c3 knight, and here black has to think about his setup very, very cautiously, because if he is simply ignoring this idea, let's say he plays c5, a3 takes, this is simply not a good position for black. It's just like that. I know this has been played by some decent players, yeah, even Karpov in the 70s, but nowadays this is kind of it is kind of clear that you should not really play like that as black. You give up the bishop pair for no clear compensation, and note that here the knight on e2 actually clogs up white's development. The knight has to move again, like here or here, then the bishop moves, then you castle, and with the capture this has sped up white's development very much. Yeah, you go bishop out and castles next. What black normally does is he switches back to a d5 approach, basically saying, okay, I'm going to play like I do in the Queen's Gambit, and I'm just retreating my bishop to e7 or to d6, both possible. And you're claiming, okay, I play a Queen's Gambit kind of setup, and you have played e3, a3, and knight to e2, and you have the bishop on c1. Isn't this kind of bad in a Queen's Gambit? Yes, it is. And this is the reason why this kind of setup is not that great for white. He can do that. It's not like he's worse or anything. It's just a position to play, but it's nothing that scares black very much. The motivation for putting d5 out is simply the case that in this kind of setup, white's pieces are simply not very well positioned to fight for the center. You really want a knight on f3 and not on e2. Yeah, white can try all kinds of things here, like taking and g3, but ultimately black has a very healthy game. He can put the bishop out, he can play c5 in the right moment if he wants. Yeah, this is how it is played. I can add a further idea, rook e8, which is my move here in this position. The idea being to even retreat all the way back to f8, preserving this bishop and then striking in the center later. It's also an interesting way to play. Yeah, this is e3. And ultimately there is the classical variation, Queen c2. Sometimes called Capablanca's variation, but classical is the most common name. With Queen c2, White is announcing his intention to play a3, getting the bishop pair, without having any structural damage. So this is kind of, he wants to have the best of all worlds in a way. What it does, however, it neglects development, yeah, of the king side especially. So here Black has various ideas, and some ideas are even very, very aggressive, trying to use this development advantage. For example, you can go d5. Here's again a case where d5 is a move, and the idea is that after
Check.
White is grabbing the bishop pair, Black can strike very aggressively in the center. For example, there are lines like that. I just want to show you one, where lines like that, where Black is getting out his pieces very quickly, and White is not even close to being castled. This is very, very sharp stuff, where Black is really going for gambit play. Yeah? This is really a very aggressive play. Black has various options of that kind. He can play this early d5. He can start with castling and
Check.
play with d5 later, trying to really open up the center very quickly. There are various gambit ideas here. For example, there are also ideas like that, where Black is all of a sudden pushing in the middle. He has castled already. Yeah, he's very quick with his pieces, while White is completely sleeping here on the king side. Yeah, he hasn't done anything here. So this is in some way a risky line, Queen c2. Yeah, it involves some risk sometimes. Yeah, your development is not great. There is this school of thought that Black should try to open up the center quickly. This is usually reached with the move d5 or castles and d5. There are other ideas. Black can also play c5, attacking again with this pawn. The big difference is that here White can very nicely take. This is not often an option in other cases because of the possible triple pawn. If we, just for comparison's sake, let's say something like this here, c5, White wouldn't want to take here probably because,
Check.
well, this is very ugly, right? Those pawns are very, very vulnerable. In the Queen c2 line, after c5, you can very safely capture because your structure here is very sound. Black will retake. Yeah, any capture here
Check.
can be answered by queen takes. Yeah, and here after bishop takes, we get very often a position like that where d and c pawn have been traded. Yeah, it's quite a flexible setup for Black, but it's not clear if it's really enough to equalize. That's one option that Black has. Another option is that Black says, okay, I'm going to give you the bishop pair, but I'll be flexible. There are various ways to do that as well. Black can start with, after Queen c2, can start with castling, and after this,
Check.
he can put out his pawns in a very flexible way. For example, he can play something like this, b6, bishop b7, this, just show you something, this kind of thing. Yeah, where Black has a very sound structure. He has no weaknesses whatsoever, and he stays very flexible with his pawns. He can, any given moment, go c5, d5 or e5, according to what White is doing. You can react accordingly. Very often this is typical for the Nimzo, that the flexibility means that you kind of look, okay, what is White doing? And then you kind of do the right thing against it all the time, which does not mean that it is passive. It's just flexible. You can react in a way that fits White's setup. The flexible approach is also something, or getting a sound structure, let's say, and being flexible, is also something that I have in my book. What I'm proposing is this line, the Zurich Variation, which is a bit comparable to what we saw before. Black here also gives up the bishop pair without having any structural compensation, but what he gets is he gets a very healthy structure. For example, it can happen like that. I just put something out, and it's fairly typical. Yeah, like this kind of thing. Yeah, this is again the dark squared center. Yeah, here we don't have c5 played. Yeah, but other than that, it kind of reminds us of this setup in the Huebner with d6, e5 played. And again, it's play on the flanks. Black wants to play f5 if possible. Sometimes you can strike with c6, sometimes with b5. Not happening that often, but there are cases where this is possible. Very often f5 would be the principled way to do it. Yeah, here white enjoys more space and he has the bishop pair, but what black has, it's very healthy long term. You don't have a bad piece, your dark squared bishop is gone and you can play those flank maneuvers, f5 or knight h5 to f4. A positive thing for black is that this is very easy to play. I mean, we have very little concrete lines that you need to learn. This is why I chose this for my repertoire book. Black also, after queen c2, has some rare options. Yeah, like d6 or b6. Yeah, for example, b6 is a funny move that actually allows e4, but then will initiate some concrete counterplay here in the center with c5. b6 recently gained some popularity, but it's not a very mainstream approach. White can also be flexible. For example, after castles, he does not have to play a3, but he can also play knight f3, which again gives black choices. c5, d5, it's all possible. An interesting moment here after castles is the move e4. Yeah, this is a sharp option, and again d5 is played, showing that you cannot allow white to give the full center without striking at it. Yeah, this is comparable to the f3 e4 line. Here the queen is on c2 instead of the pawn. You want to fight against the center here with the pawns and break the center up. Yeah, the Nimzo is a very good opening to have in the black repertoire because of its great flexibility. And as you have seen, there are very many options and structures that black can go for. It's also a good opening actually for the white player to go into because of the complexities. It is very rarely a completely dull position. There's often some kind of imbalance going on. Yeah, you have the bishop pair for worse structure, or you as white have gotten the bishop pair, but you're behind in development. These kind of things, they're all always leading to good, interesting games. So I can really recommend to think about playing the Nimzo with both colors actually. Yeah, it's also a good thing for white, as mentioned. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed this overview of some ideas and concepts of the Nimzo-Indian. And I'm going to do on and off some episodes of the series. Yeah, other openings are to be explored. There's a wide range. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.